Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the last and final chapter, Chapter 5 of The Itch. Bakugo slowly came to, feeling a vice-like pounding in his temples and a stiffness in his arms. His eyes opened, lids feeling like they weighed a kilogram apiece, and tried to mentally answer several questions that were coming in one by one. The last thing he remembered was fighting some freak with blades coming out of his mouth with icy hot. Then Shoji came running out of the woods with Dark Shadow on his tail, screaming at either of them to give some light. Dark Shadow was slashing and roaring at anything that moved, including the villain that was attacking. And then at some point, everything was cut off, and now here he was. Bakugo looked down, feeling a spike of rage when he saw he was bound in quirk-suppressant cuffs, strapped to a restraining chair, with a leather gag over his mouth. He tugged at the cuffs, the chain clinking loudly but having no give in them. "Oh, good. You're awake." His head snapped up, seeing the hand freak from the USJ sitting at a bar with some playing cards, staring at him. He growled behind his gag, glaring with the promise of 1,000 C4s worth of explosions. Shigaraki wasn't fazed at all by the glare, turned his attention away for a moment to tend 2 more cards on his stack. "I'm sure you're wondering why you're here," Shigaraki said conversationally. "Won't lie, I originally wanted you here for a completely different reason." He held up a card, examining it for a moment. "I can sort of see where you're coming from with your less than pleasant disposition, you know. You're strong, powerful, and like winning while destroying anything in your path." His cold red eyes flicked to the side under the hand's palm, pinning Bakugo in place. "I can get behind that, destroying something in your way. It's annoying, isn't it?" He turned his attention back to his house of cards, putting the card over 2 peaks. "But there's something I don't really get, something that just sort of gets under my skin with you. Here you are, a powerful, strong kid with praises and glorifications all your life, with a loving, supportive family and an entourage who thinks the sun shines out of your ass. You would think that it would be an acknowledgement of your greatness, wouldn't it?" He made a thoughtful sound before flicking the house of cards down and standing up, turning fully toward Bakugo. "I want to ask you 3 questions, Bakugo," he said, walking over and reaching out with 2 fingers apiece, each hand, to the clasps on either side of the leather gag. "And by all means, answer honestly. I'm curious." He tugged the gag down, before stepping back, putting his hands behind his back. "Fuck you!" Bakugo shouted, spitting accumulated saliva forward, barely missing Shigaraki's shoes. "When I get out of here, there's not going to be anything solid left to pick up." "Fair enough," Shigaraki replied with a shrug. "Now for my questions." He pulled a stool from the bar over to sit in front of Bakugo. "My first question. Would you give any real thought to joining me?" Bakugo visibly bristled, blood in his eye. "Eat shit and die," he snarled. "Next question," Shigaraki continued, unaffected. "Do you really think you behave like a hero should?" "Let me out of these restraints and find out," Bakugo growled, giving Shigaraki a toothy smile. "I'll show you just how heroic I am when I launch your corpse through the police station door." "Noted. Now last question, though this one comes with a few demonstrations." Shigaraki grabbed a remote from his pocket and turned to the television, turning it on and pressing a few settings before bringing up a file video that Bakugo recognized as footage from ground beta. "Watch carefully. You'll get a quiz question later." Shigaraki pressed play. Bakugo watched the footage of him entering the frame, heading down to meet All Might for the exam with Midoriya in tow. He saw Midoriya hurrying up and then himself whip around and bash him back to the ground, saying some parting words and walking on ahead. This was what they stopped the exam for, Bakugo realized, still not having been told how or why. He watched Midoriya remain on the ground motionless for several moments before crawling away, scraping his body along the pavement. The other boy seemed to be sobbing and heaving like he was going to be violently ill, the crawling and scraping looking incredibly disturbing to look at. After a shock wave from All Might sent Midoriya flying into a model car, the boy continued his crawl, scraping trek, a look of empty, blind agony twisting his features, even when All Might hurried over to assess the situation. When All Might reached out to touch him, Bakugo felt his stomach lurch when Midoriya began screaming, almost hearing it through the silence of the visual-only footage, clawing away like an animal. When Ida arrived with Recovery Girl, it only got worse, as Ida reached out for Midoriya and was subsequently attacked. Bakugo had only seen something like that on nature documentaries, of a violent, wild creature attacking something bigger than it was, with full intent to kill. Bakugo could see it on Midoriya's rage-blind face. The other boy was attacking Ito with the intention of killing him, before he was pulled away by All Might, still kicking, clawing, and screaming. And even after Aizawa hurried over with restraints, he still screamed and struggled until Midnight and Recovery Girl sedated him. Shigaraki stepped up and pressed stop on the remote, humming thoughtfully. A nasty reaction from being hit. Really. Now then. He stood in front of Bakugo, getting the boy's attention. My last question. Do you regret doing what you did to make that happen? Bakugo snapped out of whatever stupor he had been in, watching that, glaring up at Shigaraki. What I did? He snapped. I didn't do anything I haven't ever done before. Whatever the fuck was wrong with Deku was all on him. Shigaraki's eyes were unreadable, from behind the corpse hand's fingers, staring for what seemed like a full minute before he reached back into his pocket, pulled out a phone, browsing through it. Figured as much, he said, his thumb tapping through some apps before finding something. I know you're kind, Katsuki Bakugo. Some of you guys are good enough on my side, no issue. But the fact remains the same, whether you're a hero, a villain, or some punk with delusions of grandeur. He leaned in closer, eyes hardening. You think that your actions don't have consequences, simply because you're you. He held up his phone. This, Bakugo, is the consequence of your actions, of years' worth of them. Bakugo's eyes widened when he saw a graphic, disgusting image of a torn, beaten, bloody corpse on the phone's screen, able to even see the goddamn brain matter through a flattened skull. He grimaced, turning his head. The fuck are you talking about? He snapped. I didn't do that shit. Shigaraki turned the screen back to himself, looking over it appraisingly. Perhaps you didn't strike these blows, he said before pocketing the phone. But you did strike blows nonetheless, didn't you? He leaned in closer, his unblinking red eyes drilling into Bakugo's own. Is that a hero's creed nowadays? That as long as you have power you can rain down as many blows as you want onto the weaker without consequence? He scoffed. Do you even know how many of us are here because of a creed like that? Because of people like you? He stood upright. Your victim is no different. He turned his head to a door behind him. Come on in. I know you were listening. Bakugo's eyes flickered to the door, feeling his guts crawl when he saw Midoriya walk in. Deku? The leather gag being shoved back over his mouth kept him from speaking further, only able to jerk in his restraints as Midoriya stood by the bar, keeping his eyes averted and distance far. It's all right, Midoriya, Shigaraki said, smiling from behind Father. He can't get out, and he can't hurt you. He let out a soft chuckle at Midoriya's dubious look. I promise. He left Bakugo's side anyway, walking over and putting a hand on Midoriya's shoulder. I told you, didn't I? His kind feels like they can do no wrong, if no one is there to stop them. Bakugo shouted through his gag, seeing Midoriya's hollow eyes tear up from Shigaraki's words. He struggled harder in his restraints, feeling an impending trickle of doom creep down his back as he inadvertently recalled the many blows to Midoriya's body, paired to the more recent lifeless husk of a boy he'd seen glimpses of in the training camp the past few days. The recording of what had happened after he left Midoriya on the ground only made that crawl on his spine turn to ice, wondering how the hell that could have happened. Or even when or how Shigaraki got a hold of Midoriya to begin with. He let out a louder shout through the gag that went unacknowledged, seeing Shigaraki giving him a sidelong look of amusement before putting both hands, pinkies up on Midoriya's shoulders, and guiding him over to Bakugo. Do you still itch, Midoriya? Bakugo's brow furrowed at the absurd question before he noticed that Midoriya's hands were busy scratching at his arms, red marks already visible. And over his neck and collarbones, there were old scab scratch marks as well, some of which looking almost new. Midoriya nodded, a desperation glinting in his eyes. Yes, he said so softly that Bakugo almost hadn't heard it. And what did I tell you? The only way to make the itch go away is to make what caused it go away. Shigaraki's grin was visible, even behind the corpse hand. Muscular made you itch, didn't he? Yes. And what did you do about it? Midoriya's fingernails wrenched in his arms, blood trickling down his elbow and onto the floor. I made it stop, The picture that Shigaraki had shown Bakugo a few minutes ago suddenly made that much more sense, and he felt that he had just failed the biggest exam of his short life. Shigaraki laughed softly, giving Midoriya's shoulders a squeeze before letting go and stepping back until he was around the bend of the bar. "He won't stop if you let him go," he said, his voice convincingly truthful. "He'll keep hitting you, screaming at you, digging that itch deeper and deeper into your skin, twisting the knife, while no one does anything to stop him." Bakugo shouted through his gag again, shaking his head wildly as he tried to catch Midoriya's eye to convince him himself. "He'll just keep hurting you over and over and over, until you scratch yourself to pieces, until there's nothing left for him to hit or scream at." Shigaraki slipped his phone out of his pocket again, bringing up the camera function, his thumb poised over the record button. Midoriya's fingers stilled, blood staining his nails as his shoulders slumped. His head lifted, eyes like chips of emerald ice as he stared at Bakugo. Bakugo stared back, trying to convey without words that it wasn't true, that Shigaraki was full of shit, and that they needed to get out of here. There was a beat of silence before Midoriya reached up to pull the gag off of Bakugo's mouth. Bakugo inhaled sharply, jerking on his restraints. "Deku, get these things off of me," he shouted. "We have to get the fuck out of—" A sharp blow to the face cut him off, the sensation almost numb, before Bakugo felt blood dripping down open wounds on his face. His mouth opened, but he was unable to form words to say anything for the longest time. Midoriya's hands clasped on either side of his face, nails pressing in deep enough to pierce the skin, the thumbnails dangerously close to Bakugo's eyes. Midoriya's own eyes were wide, without a hint of fear or even anger. It was like an infant discovering a new sensation for the first time in its life, a realization that it could do something. His nails pressed in deeper, hands trembling softly with a crackle of power that Bakugo could feel. An image of having his head literally ripped in half came forward with enough visual accuracy to almost make Bakugo vomit with the realization that, with the threatening crackle of power pressed against his skin, it was a very real thing that Midoriya could do. Shigaraki let out a hiss of laughter through his teeth. "Go on, Midoriya," he murmured. "Scratch the itch." He pressed record. When All Might burst into the bar, with the other heroes, they were stunned to find it empty. "This is the place," Gran Torino insisted, keeping his guard up as they looked around, not finding a thing out of the ordinary except for an open laptop propped up on a shelf. After a quick sweep of the area, Ed shot, peered closer, and called their attention over. On the keypad was a sticky note with "Play Me" written on it. After a muttering from Gran Torino about goddamn villains playing games and a wary look between the other three heroes, All Might reached over to move the mouse on the screen. The black screensaver had vanished to show a video already pulled up and paused. After a moment of deliberation, All Might pressed play. A slightly shaky video showed the very bar they were standing in. The camera pointed to a person standing a short distance away. All Might inhaled sharply, recognizing Midoriya's green hair, seeing the boy standing in front of someone, his back trembling before his hand suddenly snapped from in front of him to his sides. A scream he recognized as Bakugo's tore through the laptop speakers as he saw Midoriya's fingers were covered in blood. "God damn fucking Deku!" Bakugo screamed, chains on restraints rattling, and Midoriya shifted enough that the heroes could see the sides of Bakugo's head and under his eyes bleeding. "Stop fucking around, you!" He was cut off when Midoriya slammed his fist into his solar plexus, making him double over and gag for air. The assault didn't even pause now. Midoriya grabbed Bakugo's hair and slammed his head back against the restraint chair hard, then grabbed his quirk restraint cuffs and pulled Bakugo's arms out straight before jerking his knee up into his elbows, breaking both arms in one go. The heroes could only watch in horror as Midoriya tore the leather straps restraining Bakugo back off with his bare hands and threw the other boy onto the floor, tearing and punching savagely at him and in the way All Might recalled Midoriya had done to Ida back then. But there was no one there to stop it this time. Rather, there was no one who would stop it. At some point, Bakugo's screams vanished, and all the heroes could hear was the sound of bones breaking, flesh tearing, and blood splattering under unrelenting hands. Finally, they could all see Midoriya stop punching at what little left there was to punch, and the person holding the camera let out a sigh of near contentment. "Easy now," the voice said, and All Might felt his stomach drop when he recognized it as Shigaraki's. The camera shifted to set down, propped up on the bar, and Shigaraki came into view, walking over to Midoriya and kneeling down, paying no mind to the mess that was made as he held Midoriya's shoulder quietly. "Is the itch gone?" he said, deliberately raising his voice to be heard. Next to him, Midoriya nodded, and allowed himself to be helped up. When Shigaraki turned him toward a door, the heroes could see a smile on his face, tears running down his cheeks, looking like the weight of the universe had been lifted from his shoulders. Shigaraki led him across the room, stopping by the camera. "Go get washed up and have Dobby wrap your hands," he said. "We'll take care of the mess." Midoriya's footsteps trailed off with the sound of a door shutting, and Shigaraki picked the camera back up, his red eyes glinting with unconcealed mirth. "This is what happens when you heroes fail in what really matters," the villain said, his voice quivering with emotion, both elated and angry. "When you let someone with a powerful quirk get away with murder, so long as that potential isn't wasted. Isn't it a tragedy? Or is it a comedy?" He aimed the camera at the laptop they were all watching now, uploading the footage from the training ground online with a timed post date of that day 2 minutes ago, before turning the camera back to himself. "I'll let the public decide. And don't worry about Midoriya. He's with his own kind now. The ones who were beaten down and tossed aside like he was. We'll take good care of him." The screen went to black, and then the hero saw that there was an upload notification that this very video had just been posted up to a hero video circulation site. While Gran Torino raced to the hole in the building to scream down at Tsukuchi to start finding and taking down the videos, the other heroes only watching as All Might's light faded from his eyes. Shigaraki grinned at his phone, seeing notification after notification pop up about the videos circulating around the internet now, forum posts and essay-long comments about the decline of hero morals and standards, giving him enough reading material for weeks to come. Oh, he just couldn't wait to see how UA and the Commission would spin this. He looked up from his phone to his new pet project, seeing Midoriya in his own little world, watching video footage of heroes and villains alike, filling notebooks with quirk analysis about them, and looking like a content little child doing so. The boy's fascination with quirks seemed to rival even his own master's, something that he found could make use of Midoriya without causing more psychological distress that was most definitely to come with this particular walk of life. Quirk analysis, though, was Midoriya's safe haven, and being away from people he deemed may hurt him, mostly anyone he didn't particularly know, having regressed to a mindset of still being a little quirkless weakling put him in a cocoon of contentment. Sensei said that he would see what he could do about the boy's fragile mentality, but until then, Shigaraki was tasked with keeping him safe and calm. Pretty easy to do with a computer screen and a pile of empty notebooks. Throw in some occasional food and it was almost too easy. Seriously, how could heroes or civilians screw this up? Shigaraki went back to his phone, smiling softly at the sound of the boy's mile-a-minute muttering and pencil scratching against the paper, noting that since that night, Midoriya hadn't scratched himself once. Now, Shigaraki himself had just one more big itch for himself to scratch, and thanks to Midoriya, it would be almost child's play to get rid of. All right, listeners, this concludes The Itch. Let me know your all's thoughts and reactions to this fic. I'm eager to hear what you thought. This was one of the first fanfics that I ever read in this fandom, and it's one that's just stuck with me ever since. I think the author had a really cool concept with this one and ran with it, and I really like the way they wrote this. So yeah, let me know your thoughts and reactions. If you have any other fic recommendations that are similar to this or similar concepts, let me know those as well. And as always, thank you so much for listening.